Hello, everyone. Welcome to Buoca Studio. Buoca Studio hates boring stories. If it's not fun, we don't touch it. Today, we're starting our new series on Japan's Sengoku period, the time when the entire country slowly turned into one giant battlefield. You've probably heard some of the big names from this era in games, anime, or dramas. Oda Nobunaga, Toyotomi Hideyoshi, Tokugawa Ieyasu. They were the main stars of this warring states period. But before we talk about their victories and betrayals, there's a basic question we have to ask. How did Japan become such a mess in the first place? If we don't understand that starting point, the rest of the story just feels like random fighting. So in this first episode, we'll talk about the huge turning point that opened the door to the Sengoku era, Japan's warring states period. Historians today usually mark the beginning of the Sengoku era at 1467, the year the Ōnin War broke out. The Ōnin War was a civil war that didn't just burn a city, it broke the rules of the entire country. Let's rewind to Japan. Before the Sengoku period started, Japan still looked like a very clean and stable feudal system. Here's the basic structure. At the very top, there was the emperor, treated almost like a living god, leading rituals and ceremonies. Under him stood the shogun, the top military commander. You can think of the shogun as a kind of military dictator who actually controlled politics and war. Under the shogun were the daimyō, powerful regional lords. Each daimyō ruled one region in the shogun's name. For the daimyō, the shogun was the person who really mattered because he controlled their land, their titles, and their right to go to war. The emperor was still sacred, but he did not send tax collectors or armies the shogun did. Under each daimyō were his kashindan and samurai. Kashindan were the daimyō's inner circle of loyal samurai, the close group that stayed near their lord, fought for him, and formed his core military team. Samurai were the warrior class, and under all of them were peasants and merchants, the people who actually kept the economy and daily life running. If you drew this as a chart, it would look very neat and organized. You might say, this looks like a perfectly structured country. What could possibly go wrong? This kind of system could still work if the shogun was strong, respected, and able to control the daimyō. At this point, we are in the late Muromachi period in the 1400s, just before the Sengoku era really explodes. The true decisions about war, taxes, and land were made by the shogun's government in Kyoto, called the Muromachi Bakufu, or Ashikaga Shogunate. And right at this critical moment, a man became shogun who was the worst possible fit for that job. His name was Ashikaga Yoshimasa. He became the 8th shogun of the Muromachi shogunate in 1449. The Ashikaga shogunate could still act like a real central government. If we had to sum him up in one short contrast, it would be this. In art and aesthetics, Ashikaga Yoshimasa was brilliant. Under Yoshimasa, a refined cultural style we now call Higashiyama culture blossomed in Kyoto. Tea ceremonies, ink paintings, gardens, and architecture all flourished under his taste. Even today, famous sites like Gekokujō, the Silver Pavilion, remain as physical traces of his sense of beauty. So cultural historians sometimes praise him as a great patron of the arts, a true icon of aesthetics. But if you look from the political side, the tone becomes very cold. In politics and leadership, he was a disaster. Some would say he was the man who pushed Japan one level higher on the chaos scale. And right next to this fragile shogun, there was a woman who absolutely refused to be fragile. She was his wife, Hino Tomiko. Hino Tomiko came from a powerful noble family in Kyoto. She wasn't the kind of wife who sat quietly behind a screen, just watching from the shadows. She became deeply involved in the finances of the shogunate, the network of noble families and daimyō that supported the regime. While Yoshimasa spent more and more time in tea rooms, gardens, and art, Tomiko was dealing with money, favors, and promises. At the center of her heart, there was one simple, burning thought: my family's power. It must never collapse. When Yoshimasa first became shogun, he had no son. That fact alone created a quiet tension inside the Muromachi shogunate in Kyoto. Everyone knew that sooner or later, someone had to be named as the next shogun. So Yoshimasa made a decision. He called his younger brother, Ashikaga Yoshimi, back from temple life. Yoshimi had already become a Buddhist monk. He had left worldly life behind, and he might have thought his path was already set. Then a message came. Come back to Kyoto. Your older brother wants to see you. Imagine what Yoshimi felt when he stepped into the shogun's headquarters in Kyoto again. He smelled incense, saw polished floors, and heard the hushed voices of attendants. He had left this world, but this world had not completely left him. Yoshimasa looked at his brother and said, in effect, I don't have a son. You will be my successor. You will become the next shogun. It sounded like a gift, but also like a trap. Somewhere inside, Yoshimi had to feel a cold question. What if my brother later has a son? Will I just be thrown away like an extra piece in a game? Yoshimasa saw that fear, and he tried to calm it with a very strong promise. Even if I have a son in the future, I will send that boy to a temple to become a monk. You will still be my heir. If this promise had been kept until the end, the story of Japan might have been much quieter. But history, as always, had terrible timing. In 1465, Yoshimasa finally had a son, Ashikaga Yoshihisa. The moment that baby cried, the air in the palace changed. For the nobles and courtiers, the situation suddenly became complicated. Old promises and new realities crashed into each other. But for Hino Tomiko, there was no confusion at all. She thought, my husband is the shogun. This child carried the shogun's blood. Of course, he is the rightful successor. For her, the idea of sending her son to a temple because of some old promise between brothers felt like an insult, almost a crime. So in Tomiko's heart, a quiet war began long before any soldiers moved. From that moment on, the old promise between Yoshimasa and Yoshimi began to crack. And this was the moment when a private fear turned into a real political problem. From this point on, Yoshimasa faced the most basic duty of a ruler, deciding who should come after him. However, he let the question hang in the air, delayed it again and again. At this point, the situation had two clear options. One option was to keep the promise. In that case, Yoshihisa would be sent to a temple as a monk, and Yoshimi would be confirmed as the official heir. The other option was to break the promise. In that case, Yoshimasa would put his own child first, make Yoshihisa the heir, and push Yoshimi aside. It was a painful choice because either way, someone would feel betrayed. A strong shogun would have chosen one path, taken full responsibility, and never looked back. But Yoshimasa was not that kind of shogun. He began to hesitate. He tried to smile at both sides. To Yoshimi, he let the old promise hang in the air. To Tomiko, he let hope grow and did not clearly deny her expectations. Little by little, Yoshimasa was doing the most dangerous thing a leader can do. He was promising two different futures to two different people. If we zoom in on this moment, Yoshimi the brother thought, I gave up temple peace and returned to this world. I accepted the risk, the politics, the blood. If I am thrown away now, what was all of that for? Tomiko, the wife and mother, thought, if my son is not made heir, he will live his whole life under someone else's shadow. He could be used, controlled, or even killed. I cannot allow that future. Yoshimasa, the shogun, probably thought something like this. If I choose my brother, my wife will hate me, and my son will live in danger. If I choose my son, my brother will feel betrayed forever. Whoever I choose, one face will turn away from me. Instead of facing one of those faces, Yoshimasa did what weak leaders often do. He turned away from both. He postponed meetings. He walked out of council rooms and into tea rooms. He escaped from politics into art, hoping the storm would somehow pass by itself. But storms do not disappear just because a man closes a door. While Yoshimasa avoided reality, the people around him could not. Whispers started in palace corridors and noble houses. Shouldn't the shogun's own son be the heir? If the younger brother takes everything, won't that cause even more trouble later? At the same time, Hino Tomiko stopped whispering and began to act. She made her position clear. The next shogun is my son Yoshihisa. Then she used every tool she had. She used shogunate funds, money to reward and pull people in. She relied on her noble family network, relatives with influence in court and temples. She built alliances with daimyō, regional lords who were always looking for an advantage. Piece by piece, the political map around Yoshimasa split into two camps. One side was the Yoshimi faction, nobles and daimyō who supported the younger brother as heir. The other side was the Yoshihisa faction, nobles and daimyō who supported the baby son, guided by his mother, Tomiko. Every time Yoshimasa failed to give a clear answer, both sides watched him a little more coldly. On the Yoshimi side, people felt a rising bitterness. Did Yoshimasa bring Yoshimi back from temple life just to use him and then throw him away? On the Yoshihisa side, people grew impatient. If the shogun truly wants his son as heir, why doesn't he say it out loud and end this? At first, this was just a family drama inside one powerful house. There was a brother, a wife, a child, and a weak man in the middle. But this house was the house of the shogun. Every noble and daimyo across Japan watched this open wound and thought, which side should I stand on to protect my own land and power? This is where the story stopped being just a palace drama and started becoming a national crisis. The succession question turned into something much bigger. For each daimyo, choosing a side was a strategic move. If their side won, they might gain land, titles, and influence. If their side lost, they could lose everything. The tension kept building, like dry wood piling up in a city that hadn't seen rain in years. All it needed was a spark. Finally, that spark came in 1467. In 1467, violence finally exploded. In and around Kyoto, the capital, forces supporting Yoshimi and forces supporting Yoshihisa raised their banners and marched. Streets that had once seen quiet processions of nobles and monks now echoed with marching boots and shouted orders. This was the beginning of the Ōnin War. The war lasted from 1467 to 1477, about 11 years of on and off fighting. At the center of this civil war stood two powerful Shugo daimyo, Hosokawa Katsumoto and Yamana Sōzen. Shugo daimyo were military governors who controlled huge regions and commanded large armies in the name of the shogun. Hosokawa threw his weight behind Yoshimi, the shogun's brother, while Yamana supported the infant son, Yoshihisa, protected by Hino Tomiko. Their rivalry split Kyoto's samurai into two armed camps. People began to call Hosokawa's side the Eastern Army and Yamana's side the Western Army. These two armies dug in across the capital, burning mansions, temples, and whole districts as they fought street by street. For the people who lived there, Kyoto stopped feeling like a sacred capital and started to feel like a giant, open battlefield. While all this was happening, Yoshimasa still seemed more absorbed in gardens and art than in stopping the war. For anyone watching, his weakness as a leader was now impossible to ignore. On the surface, people could still pretend this is just a dispute about who will be the next shogun. But on the ground, the reality was much darker. Daimyo from all over Japan joined the conflict. Many feared, if I stay neutral, I'll be left behind when the new power map is drawn. The succession fight became a giant pick-your-faction war, dragging in powerful samurai armies from across the country. At first, people still remembered why the war had started, but as the years dragged on, that question faded under hunger, fear, and exhaustion. Somewhere in the middle of this chaos, ordinary people must have asked, we don't even remember how this started. Why are we still fighting? And yet, the fighting continued. There was no clear winner. No side could proudly say, we crushed our enemies and took everything. 11 years after the Ōnin War began, it ended with no real winner. The armies went home or moved elsewhere. But one thing was perfectly clear in everyone's mind. The shogun is not as powerful as we thought. His orders do not protect us. His authority is an illusion. The Muromachi shogunate still existed in name. The shogun still sat in Kyoto, but many daimyo no longer feared or respected him. The end of the Ōnin War did not mean peace. It was more like the opening act of a much longer play. Out in the regions, each daimyo now acted like a small king of his own domain. On the map, this still looked like one country called Japan. In reality, it was closer to a cluster of mini-states, each controlled by a warlord, who did whatever he thought was necessary to survive and grow. Alliances were made and broken just as quickly. A daimyo might swear loyalty one year and launch a surprise attack the next. That neighbor looks weak now. Maybe this is our chance to take his castle. The real law of the land became very simple. If you don't grow stronger, someone else will use you as their ladder. This was the true beginning of the Sengoku period, Japan's warring states era, where endless fighting and shifting alliances became normal. Over the next decades, some daimyo swallowed their neighbors and built large, powerful domains, while others lost a single battle and disappeared from history. During and after the Ōnin War, many traditional Shugo daimyo were often absent from their home provinces, living in Kyoto or simply losing control of their territories. In that vacuum, powerful deputies and senior kashin, the top members of a daimyo's kashindan, stepped in and quietly became the real rulers. Sometimes even whole kashindan. The inner samurai bands who used to serve their daimyo rose up, killed their own lord, and seized the domain for themselves. This kind of the low overthrowing the high became so common that later people gave it a name, Gekokujō, meaning those below overthrow those above. Both the emperor and the shogun still existed as formal institutions, but more and more they felt like scarecrows, dressed in old authority. Their titles remained, their ceremonies continued, but the real decisions about land, war, and survival were now being made far away from Kyoto by ambitious local warlords. To understand what happens next, we had to start with the Ōnin War. By 1477, it had left Japan with a weak shogun, a shattered capital, and a map full of hungry daimyo. After that, Japan did not calm down. It fractured even further. For decades, it was chaos in every direction. Local wars, shifting alliances, raw power grabs. Then we jump to the 1550s. That is when the chaos finally gets a face. Out of this chaos, certain names began to shine. Oda Nobunaga of Owari, a ruthless innovator who hated old rules. Uesugi Kenshin, the dragon of Echigo, famed for his skill and honor. Takeda Shingen, the tiger of Kai, a fearsome daimyo of cavalry and strategy. Tokugawa Ieyasu of Mikawa, patient, careful, and very hard to kill. The ultimate from nobody to ruler story, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. All of them were standing on ground that had already been destroyed by the Ōnin War. This constant competition made the Sengoku period feel brutal, but also strangely exciting. If we had to summarize it in one line, it would be this. The Ōnin War was not just one civil war. It was a system failure that broke the old rules of Japan and forced everyone to fight in a new, brutal world. If you enjoyed this episode of our Sengoku series, make sure to drop a like and subscribe and let me know your thoughts in the comments. It gives me huge energy to keep making these videos. I'll see you again in second episode of our Japan Sengoku series. Thank you.